Hi, I'm Doug Dormer. This is the Business of Health Informatics, B641. This is Module 5, Lesson 2. I'll be talking here about the technology adoption curve and the technology hype cycle. The technology adoption curve and the hype cycle are both examples of pretty simple concepts, really, that are pretty intuitive, but are expressed in a way that gives them particular significance. This comes from Jeffrey Moore in his book, Crossing the Chasm, written, the mid 90s, I believe, maybe around early 1990s. I've been reading it since then and using it, and I keep it handy. I go back to it on a reasonably frequent basis. And here he talks about how a new technology is adopted in the marketplace. In the beginning, you have the innovators, tech enthusiasts in this first block, the early market. You have innovators, you might have visionaries, people who say, wow, that's leading edge, but it's very cool. Then you get to something called the chasm, which I'll come back to in a second. Then you get to pragmatists, the people that say, okay, this satisfies me. I can see how this works in my environment. I'm satisfied. I will proceed to adopt this technology. After that, you have the late majority. That pragmatists are the early majority. Then you have the late majority. They're people who say, all right, I can see it. And more important, I can see that my competitors and my peers are doing this. So it's relatively low risk. So I'm going to get on board. That's the late majority. After that, you get to skeptics. Well, and this is a line I hear in healthcare a lot, particularly around health IT. I'm going to retire in a few years anyway. Why do I really want to invest in this whole notion of electronic health workers? My gosh, I'm just going to ride it out. And if I get some penalties, I get some penalties. I'm going to be gone in 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. I'm not going to do this. And they get dragged into it. Now, those behaviors are entirely intuitive. And I can't say how precisely the statistics represent every niche, every market. But it's a pretty good way to look at how we're adopting new technology. Now for the chasm. That's a critical point. When you have innovators, you have one-on-one sales, you have the people who have an idea, often working with the people for whom they're making a product. They might be in the same company, might be a vendor to a company, but they're saying, let me make this for you exactly what you need. Those are the innovators. Then the visionaries say, wow, I saw what you did with them. Let me keep up with them. I'm a leader in this industry, and I'm satisfied that it works. And besides, I'm satisfied that I have enough confidence in myself and in you. Let's put this to work. Let's see what the results are. Those are the early adopters, the visionaries. Now, from there to getting to general market acceptance, even amongst the pragmatists, the early majority, that's a big step. It shows a small gap here, but don't underestimate it. That's a critical piece in how we move from early stage to full adoption. Now, of course, a lot of things can affect that. If the federal government says, thou shalt use electronic health records, well, you can get past that chasm with reasonable confidence. But if you're relying on the market to take you there, for example, in healthcare, it's not enough to say, I've demonstrated that we can improve health outcomes. You also have to demonstrate financially what's in it for whomever your stakeholder is, for whoever's going to make the buying decision. And that becomes much harder. We see it in so many cases. Questions in the case of pharmaceutical industry. Are we making, if we could have a choice between a drug which will manage a condition for the rest of your life, making an annuity stream for us, or are we looking at a thing which can cure you one time and be done, and you won't have to ever see me again? Which of those is someone more inclined to do? Now, I'm not making a value judgment to say that's how all companies behave, or even any companies behave. But I'm saying it's a consideration. You're looking at what's the economic impact of doing this, as well as the impact on health outcomes. And so when we talk, as we did last week, about suicide prevention, who benefits and how do they measure the benefit they get? It varies by who the stakeholder is. And so getting to this chasm, understanding this chasm, is going to be a critical piece. And in your work, in your projects, you'll need to be thinking about, am I proposing a solution that I am looking to bring to market, in which case I need to know where I am relative to the chasm? Or am I designing something purely for my organization? So when I ask you tell me about your organization's culture, I'm looking for you to say, are we visionaries? Are we early adopters? Are we suited to that kind of behavior? Or are we a pragmatist or a conservative organization? Any of those may be perfectly valid, but then you have to understand what solution you're likely to implement and likely to be comfortable implementing. So this is a really important notion for us to keep in mind. The second major notion is the Gartner hype cycle. Now, Gartner is one of the premier consultancies around technology broadly in the world. They have a huge group that focuses specifically on healthcare. So they have really serious executives, many of whom were in practice, were the health IT practitioners at major institutions who now are consultants providing their services to the healthcare industry. In full disclosure, my son worked for them as a vice president. And so, again, I think Gartner is expressing here a really intuitive kind of idea, but they're doing it really well. And then they've done the analysis work to support it with empirical evidence. The basic idea of the Gartner hype cycle is that when a new technology is adopted, if it looks like it's got great value, my gosh, it can shoot up in the expectations all the way to some really, really high point right away in a short time. What they call, it reaches the peak of inflated expectations. And then for some reason, it doesn't roll out quite that way and it crashes. And then all of a sudden, the solution is not as though it didn't exist, but its use cases are fewer. And its value proposition has to stand individually on its own. It's not a global assumed value proposition. And from that, it gradually builds back until it plateaus someplace not as high perhaps as the original expectation, but sometimes pretty darn close. But it's underpinned with realistic expectations. This is the Gartner hype cycle. So many examples of the Gartner hype cycle. One in healthcare from the early 2000s, when there was a huge focus following HIPAA on security and privacy, was the adoption of breach notification tools. So they could tell you anytime your systems were being penetrated or you were at risk of being attacked. When that technology was first adopted, my gosh, everybody had to get it. It was wonderful. I'm going to have it. Funny thing happened, though. It was triggering so many alerts that people were having multiple alerts through the day, through the evening, at night. They said, holy cow, and almost all of these, or a high percentage of these, aren't real attacks. They're just misreadings of normal activity with respect to our networks. Or they're innocent kinds of bumping into it, people doing a search and finding it not really a concerted attack. And so they started tweaking it, dialing it back, setting the standards for the alarms to be much less sensitive. And people stopped buying it and it crashed, came way down in terms of the value in that. And then slowly it started to come back up. And then it became a normal and accepted a fundamental part of our IT security and privacy infrastructure. Another example that comes from my own experience, and this is a little bit of a story that I want you to think about. I've been attending HIMSS for, 15 or 20 years. You all know HIMSS. And it's a wonderful conference. And about 15 years ago, I was in line to ask a panel a question. It was a panel on consumer health informatics, which is kind of my particular area of interest, or one of my areas of interest. And the fellow in front of me, as we're going up to the line, asked every question I wanted to ask right in front of me. So then he stepped away, and it was my turn. And I looked at him and I kind of said, what he asked. And everybody had a good laugh, and I stepped away. So when that session was done, it was almost over then, I followed him out, and I caught up with him, and we chatted. And he said, well, where are you going? I said, I'm going where you're going. What's the next meeting? And we went to that, and then we went out and had lunch. And his name was John Moore, and he was the founder of a then new company called Chillmark Research, which has become the premier health information technology analyst. It is to healthcare technology within healthcare what Gartner is globally to all of technology. It's that important. Now, in the early days, when John was running on a shoestring and getting this set up, and I had latched onto him, I said, "This is a brilliant man. I need to follow this guy." And he would call and we'd say, "Okay, what are you going to this next?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm going to the Robert Wood Johnson." He'd say, "Okay, I'm going to the thus and so conference." And we'd say, "All right, let's meet on a certain day, 2 days after our conferences are done, and exchange notes." And so it was a wonderful opportunity for me to get value at a time that I couldn't afford his expensive services. And he got value from me reporting on places that he was not able to attend. It was a wonderful relationship. So for years, I relied on him. People would say, "What's your opinion of something?" I would say, "What he said." About 2 years ago, 2 years, 2023, I was inviting him to speak to our class, this class, and he wasn't responding. He didn't get back to me. And I forget exactly how it happened. I sent a note, I did something, and I got a note back from him that said, "Doug, so sorry. I plan to attend this coming HIMSS meeting, but I can't." And it actually was in March by the time this whole thread goes through. HIMSS was in March. I can't. It was to be my last hurrah, my swan song. And he told me he had cancer and knew he was dying at that point. Now, this is a young man, younger than I am by a fair bit, and a brilliant man and a good friend. And so he passed away that summer, and I continue when I go to a conference like that, my obligation, my quiet obligation, I try to tweet what's going on, or now use X, and maybe I'll be doing it more in Substack this year. I try to communicate to the world what's going on, and whenever I do it, it is a tribute to my friend John Moore. Now, when you go to HIMSS, for example, and I'll use only one example because I could have a number of them, there was one year when the hot topic, the emerging technologies, plural, were all around analytics. And so he would come up to me and he would hold open his suit coat vest and he would say, and he would pull out a piece of paper and he'd say, "Want some analytics? I got some analytics right here. Here's some analytics." He was doing it as though he was selling illegal drugs or some kind of contraband. And because everybody that he would run into, the hot topic was selling analytics. Now, analytics hasn't gone away. It has certainly embedded itself. We're doing it more than ever. We're seeing revolution with generative AI around analytics. And yet it pursued this exact hype cycle that you see here. It went crazy and then it settled down and now it's kind of plateauing back at a much more reasonable level. So I want you to have this in mind, this notion, these two notions. One, of the technology adoption life cycle. Where is your organization within that? And on the other hand, with respect to the technology writ large, where are we on the Gartner hype cycle? Now, one last comment on this is to distinguish between, for example, in the case of AI, and you'll notice on here, there are some examples. There's AI supercomputing is still on the rise. Federated machine learning is climbing. Reinforcement learning is climbing. Artificial general intelligence is climbing. Prompt engineering is getting near the top. AI Trism, I don't know what that is. AI developer portals, they think are now at about the top of their expectation. AI augmented software engineering, something I dearly love, is at the peak of its expectation. Generative AI is already past the peak of expectations and is beginning what they think is kind of a crash, moving its way down to get to generative AI isn't all it was cracked up to be, kind of an attitude, and then building forward till it gets to a real world kind of utilization. Later today, I'll show you an example of where generative AI didn't do all I thought it could do, and it illustrates that pattern. What I want you to take away is this. We don't really care about what this hype cycle is doing for AI broadly, for generative AI broadly. We care about how can we use it for our narrow, specific purposes in our organization. We, in fact, are one of the determinants of where we are on that curve, but we are not as vulnerable to the curve itself. We are looking for narrow, practical business applications addressing real-world business problems. That's the frame of reference I want you to have. Which brings us back to our workflow. This is where we fit, really making the point I just made. We don't deal in the broad notion of where is AI broadly, for example. We deal in how does it fit into our business workflow model, our solution workflow. How does it work to developing a need, identifying stakeholders? How do we fit it in within our framework? Well, that's it on Module 2. Next up is Lesson 3, when I will talk about your assignments, developing your need and problem statements.